Happy Wednesday. Hope everybody's having a good week so far. I just wanted to uh, make a short video and answer some of the questions you guys had about postmodernism because they were really good questions. So I'm just going to read them and talk a little bit about them in case you want a little more information or want your question answered. So this is Postmodernism Talks with Miss Robinson. So the first question is, what is more important to the postmodern period, art or literature? I would say they're both pretty equally important. Postmodernism was probably started by visual artists. Um, there's a little gray area there, but art was extremely important to the postmodern movement. Um, you can just do slightly different things with art and literature, and when you play around with the form of them, it's a little different, but they were both very important. Next question was, how did text today compare with text written during the postmodern movement? I think texts today have kind of become more, most novels have become more realistic in a lot of senses, but there are some qualities of postmodern literature that I think stick around. So, like pastiche and writing in kind of mini narratives, a lot of authors still do that, and I think they get that from postmodernism. I just think they do it in a slightly more realistic way now. When you begin doing something, you always kind of take it to its extreme form and push it. So that's what postmodernists were doing. Someone asked, do any elements other than paranoia and opposition to authority overlap with each other? Which is a really good question. And I would say black humor overlaps a lot with irony and playfulness, especially the irony part, because a lot of times the black humor is ironic in some sense. When did postmodernism officially begin and when did it end, according to the people who think it has ended? The literary portion of postmodernism really begins in the 1960s, and I think people mostly think it ended in the early to mid 80s. And I'd say that the literary portion ended before the art portion of postmodernism. Is pastiche often used in American literature? I talked about that a little bit, but I think it still is. I think that we still mix genres, especially if you think about authors nowadays who sort of write in a like confessional kind of memoir sense. I think they get that from postmodernists. Like if you write like it seems like a diary. Why did postmodernist thinkers rebel against ideas they knew were true? Was it just to be rebellious, or was there a point to it? I think that the ideas that they rebelled against, they didn't necessarily think were true. I hope I didn't quite word it that way in the presentation, but I think that they rebelled against like widely accepted truths, and tried to get across the fact that they weren't necessarily true and get people to question them. Also, I think they just thought that questioning what you are told is a good idea, because you might end up believing that thing, but at least you've thought about it. Are elements of postmodernism more opinionated versus right and wrong? Heavily opinionated. I think maybe this question is asking, like, if you're identifying elements of postmodern literature, is it necessarily there or not there? Hopefully that's what that means. But it's very opinionated and open to interpretation. So if you think that you see an element of postmodernism in a piece of literature, as long as you've got some good evidence that fits the definition, you're probably going to be good to go. Do you think some of the movements today, like the Black Lives Matter movement, could reflect some of those postmodern ideals? I definitely do. That's a really good question. Opposition to authority, for sure. That had been going on before the postmodern movement, obviously, in the civil rights movement, like peaceful opposition to authority that people feel is acting in a way that's abusing their authority. But I also think that the idea that truth is relative is an important thing to think about when it comes to that movement, because that movement, I think, is trying to get us to think about the perspective of other people. And postmodernism really believes that everything is based on perspective. So my perspective is my reality, and so I should believe that the perspective of other people, who, especially people in the minority, are their reality. Let's see. Okay, one more question is the next to last question is, how is postmodernism related to the other American literature movements we have studied? So in addition to using and building on those and movements and using them in pastiche, which postmodernism definitely does, I think that hopefully we can see this evolution where American literature started out like in the colonial era, really focused on religion and documenting facts about the survival of colonial people, and then transitioned into like this romantic idea of building a country with romanticism, then transitioned into this era of realistic writing and transcendental thinking, where we were exploring slightly larger ideas, and then into modernism. I think that postmodernism, I don't know, I don't think it's even as dark as modernism. I think it's kind of a reaction to that kind of pessimism. It definitely contains some pessimism, but it has a lot more fun with things. And it was a more affluent time in America, but also a very confusing one, because there was a pretty hectic, long-lasting war, the Vietnam War, and that's a big, long explanation. But I think it builds, and it also borrows little pieces and parts from those other movements. Last question is, this is a long question. So this person says, I've been reading about a French philosopher named Sartre. He said that we have to embrace the absurdity of the world and accept that things are weird. He isn't American, but would he be considered postmodern? And is this Frenchman if this Frenchman is postmodern, was it really a global thing or mostly centered on America? Okay, that's several different questions, but it was definitely a global thing. We are focused on postmodernism in America because we're studying American literature, but it was definitely a global thing. Sartre, I'm not an expert in philosophy, but I think he had some ideas that could play into postmodernism, but I don't think he is typically considered a postmodern philosopher. But I think that there are some other French philosophers who are definitely considered postmodern, like Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, if you want to look up some postmodern French philosophy. And then on the American side, Judith Butler is a widely known postmodern philosopher. Postmodern philosophy is, I think, incredibly hard to read. It's interesting, though. So thank you guys so much for your really good questions. And I hope that my answers help expand postmodernism for you a little bit. I hope you enjoy I Bought a Little City. Let me know what you think after you read it. And have a good rest of your week.